Picture this. You're sitting at your kitchen table on a Tuesday night, phone in hand, checking your bank account the way you've checked it 1,000 times before. Except this time, the number starts with a 1 and has 5 zeros after it, and for a second, you just stare at it. Not because you're confused, not because you think there's been some kind of mistake, but because something feels fundamentally different and you can't quite explain why. It's not just that the number is bigger, it's that your brain is processing money in a way it never has before. The anxiety that used to live permanently in the back of your mind, that low-level financial hum that never quite goes away, it's not just quieter, it's a different frequency entirely. Here's what's interesting though. Most people who are grinding towards 6 figures in savings think the difference between 10,000 and 100,000 is just math. 10 times the money, 10 times the security. Simple multiplication. But that's not what actually happens. The shift that occurs when you cross $100,000 isn't a linear experience. It's not an extension of what you felt at 10,000 or 20,000. It's a completely different psychological and financial experience. And if you've ever wondered why some people seem to pull away from the pack financially while others stay stuck at the same level for years, this is a big part of the answer. My name is Nick, and I spend way too much time thinking about money, financial psychology, and the specific milestones that separate people who build real wealth from people who stay permanently one emergency away from disaster. If you want to understand the actual mechanics of what happens at different savings levels, not just the surface-level advice you've heard 100 times, make sure to hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if it ends up changing how you think about the number you're working toward. Now, before we get into what makes $100,000 so different, I want to acknowledge something. If you've watched the videos on this channel about $10,000 and $20,000 in savings, you already know that every milestone does something distinct to your psychology and your options. $10,000 gets you out of pure survival mode. $20,000 gives you walking away money and starts the compound interest engine. But $100,000 is where something else entirely begins, something that most financial content completely fails to explain. And it starts with the math finally getting loud. Here's what I mean. When you have $10,000 invested at an 8% annual return, you're generating $800 per year in growth. That's real money. That's not nothing. But let's be honest with each other. $800 a year is $66 a month. It barely covers a cell phone bill. Your money is working for you, technically, but it's working so quietly you can barely hear it. The psychological impact of that $800 is almost zero because it doesn't change your daily reality in any meaningful way. You can't see it, you can't feel it. It's just a number on a screen that grows slightly less slowly than it did before. Now let's talk about what happens at $100,000. That same 8% annual return is now generating $8,000 per year. Let me say that again, $8,000. That's $666 per month flowing into your account without you doing a single thing to earn it, without showing up to work, without answering emails, without trading your time for anything. That's a car payment, a significant chunk of rent, a monthly grocery bill for a family appearing in your portfolio every single month because you had the discipline to build a foundation. This is the point where compound interest stops being a concept you read about in personal finance articles and starts being something you can actually feel in your financial life. But here's what makes this really interesting. The $8,000 your $100,000 generates this year gets added to your principal. So next year, you're earning 8% on $108,000, which means next year you generate $8,640. The year after that, $9,331. The year after that, over $10,000. Your money is now producing more than $10,000 per year in growth, and you haven't added a single additional dollar. The engine isn't just running, it's accelerating on its own. And that acceleration is something you simply cannot experience at $10,000 or $20,000 because the numbers are too small for the math to feel real. At $100,000, it becomes impossible to ignore.
Think about what this means practically. If you stopped saving entirely at $100,000 and just let it sit in a diversified index fund averaging 8% annually, in 30 years, you'd have over $1 million from doing nothing, from making zero additional contributions, from just having the patience to leave money alone that you already saved. That's not a fantasy. That's not some get-rich-quick promise. That's basic mathematics applied to a real number that real people reach every single day. The magic was always in the math. You just needed enough money for the math to start showing up in your life instead of just on paper. Now, here's where the $100,000 milestone does something that $10,000 and $20,000 never could. It changes your identity. Not in some abstract motivational poster way, in a very concrete, practical, this affects every financial decision you make going forward kind of way. When you have $10,000 saved, you are a saver. You are someone who has demonstrated discipline, built an emergency fund, proven to yourself that you can delay gratification. That's genuinely meaningful, and don't let anyone tell you otherwise. But you are still fundamentally playing defense with your money. Your primary relationship with your savings is protective. It's a buffer between you and financial disaster. When you hit $100,000, something shifts. You stop being purely a saver and you become an investor. And that distinction matters more than most people realize. A saver asks, how do I keep this money safe? An investor asks, how do I put this money to work? A saver thinks about what could go wrong. An investor thinks about what could go right. A saver measures success by the number staying stable. An investor measures success by the number growing. This isn't just a mindset shift you decide to have. It's a shift that happens naturally because the math at $100,000 demands it. When your portfolio is generating $8,000 a year in returns, you start paying attention to investment strategy in a way you never did at $10,000 because the stakes are actually meaningful now. A 1% difference in returns isn't $100 per year anymore, it's $1,000 per year. The decisions matter more, so you make them more carefully.
This identity shift creates a completely different relationship with financial information. When you had $10,000, reading about portfolio allocation and asset diversification and rebalancing strategies felt theoretical, like studying for a test you weren't sure you'd ever take. When you have $100,000, that same information becomes operational. You're not learning about investing anymore, you're making investing decisions. You're comparing expense ratios on index funds because a 0.5% difference in fees now costs you $500 per year. You're thinking about tax efficiency because the numbers are large enough that taxes actually matter. You are operating in a completely different league of financial engagement than you were at any previous milestone. And here's something that catches most people completely off guard when they reach six figures in savings. The world starts treating you differently. Not in some obvious social status way, in a financial access way that quietly but dramatically expands what's available to you. Let me give you some specific examples, because this is one of those things that sounds vague until you see it laid out concretely. When you have $100,000 invested with a brokerage, you typically unlock lower fee investment options, priority customer service, and in many cases, dedicated financial advisors who don't charge hourly rates. At Vanguard, $100,000 gets you into investor shares on funds that were previously inaccessible. At Fidelity and Schwab, you unlock premium tiers that come with benefits that literally cost you nothing but require the account balance to activate. This might sound minor, but the fee differences alone can add up to tens of thousands of dollars over a 20 or 30-year investing horizon. Beyond brokerage perks, $100,000 in savings changes your negotiating position in almost every major financial transaction. When you're applying for a mortgage, the underwriter isn't just looking at your income, they're looking at your reserves. Having six figures in accessible savings signals to lenders that you are a fundamentally different credit risk than someone with $15,000 saved. You get better rates, you get more options, and you have the leverage to walk away from deals that don't work for you because you're not desperate. The same dynamic plays out when you're negotiating a car purchase, a business contract, or a salary offer. Money creates options, and $100,000 creates options that smaller amounts simply cannot. There's also an investment access dimension that most people at earlier saving stages never encounter. Certain real estate investment opportunities, private lending arrangements, and small business investment deals have informal minimums that start around $50,000 to $100,000. Not because they're legally restricted, but because that's where the math starts making sense for the investor and the opportunity. When you have $100,000, you can participate in deals that people with $20,000 can't, not because you're smarter or more sophisticated, but simply because you have enough capital for the opportunity to be worth pursuing. But here's the part that most financial content completely skips over, and I think it might be the most psychologically interesting thing that happens at this milestone. Your fear changes direction. When you have $10,000 or $20,000 saved, your primary financial fear is losing your income, because without your income, your savings disappear in a matter of months and you're back to zero. The job is everything. Losing the job is the nightmare scenario. All of your financial anxiety is pointed at income preservation. Keep the job. Don't rock the boat. Don't take risks that could threaten the paycheck. When you hit $100,000, your fear doesn't disappear, but it rotates. Instead of fearing the loss of income above everything else, you start fearing bad investment decisions. You start worrying about market cycles and economic downturns, not because you're paranoid, but because you now have something real to protect and grow. This is a fundamentally more productive fear. It's a fear that makes you smarter about money rather than just more anxious about money. The person who is terrified of losing their job makes defensive decisions. The person who is focused on protecting and growing $100,000 makes strategic decisions, and strategic decisions compound over time in a way that defensive decisions never do. There's also a confidence shift that happens at this level that affects your career in ways that are genuinely hard to quantify but impossible to miss once you experience them. At $10,000 saved, you had what I called walking away money in a previous video. You could survive a few months without income. That gave you some negotiating leverage, but at $100,000, you have genuine optionality. You could take 6 months or even a year to find the right next opportunity instead of the first available one. You could start a business with actual runway instead of hoping it works out in 3 months before you run out of money. You could consult part-time and test whether you want to leave your full-time job before making an irreversible decision. The psychological difference between months of runway and a year or more of runway is not proportional. It is transformational. Knowing you can afford to wait for the right thing rather than grabbing whatever is available changes how you carry yourself in every professional context. People notice. Opportunities find you differently when you're not visibly desperate. Now, let's run some numbers that I think will genuinely surprise you. Because one of the things that happens when people think about $100,000 in savings is they anchor on the number itself and miss what the number does over time. Let's say you're 30 years old and you've just hit $100,000. You keep contributing $1,000 per month and you earn an average of 8% annually. By the time you're 50, you don't have $340,000, you don't have $500,000, you have over $1,200,000. The $100,000 you built over years of discipline and sacrifice does as much work over the next 20 years as all the contributions you'll make combined. Think about that. The foundation you built is going to match the effort of the next 2 decades of saving, dollar for dollar. That's not motivation speak, that's a spreadsheet. Compare that to someone who starts from zero at 30 with the same $1,000 per month contribution and the same 8% return. By 50, they have around $589,000. The person who had $100,000 as a starting point has more than double the outcome. Not because they worked twice as hard or made twice as much money, but because they had a head start that the math turned into an enormous advantage. This is the real reason people say the first $100,000 is the hardest. It's not that saving $100,000 is mechanically more difficult than saving the next $100,000. It's that the first $100,000 is doing the least amount of compounding work. Every dollar you save after that has a bigger engine behind it. Here's something else worth understanding about this milestone that rarely gets discussed honestly. A lot of people who reach $100,000 in savings don't feel it the way they expected to. They built it up in their minds as this transformational moment. They imagined they'd cross the threshold and feel wealthy, feel arrived, feel like a completely different person. And then they check their balance, see the 6 figures, feel a brief flush of satisfaction, and go back to their lives largely unchanged. If this happens to you, it doesn't mean you've done something wrong. It means you've been confusing a financial milestone with a psychological destination. The transformation that $100,000 creates isn't a single dramatic moment. It's a gradual recalibration of how you see every financial decision going forward. It shows up 6 months later when you negotiate your salary and feel zero anxiety about the possibility of them saying no. It shows up when a market correction hits, and instead of panicking, you see it as an opportunity to buy at lower prices. It shows when a friend mentions a business idea, and instead of immediately thinking, "I could never be involved in something like that," you find yourself genuinely running the numbers. The shift isn't a lightning bolt, it's a slow rewiring that you only notice when you look back and realize you're making decisions from a completely different foundation than you were 2 years ago. But here's where most people mess this up. And I want to be direct about this because I've seen it happen over and over. They hit $100,000 and they celebrate by doing something that feels like they've earned a reward, but functionally dismantles the foundation they spent years building. Maybe they buy a new car because they can finally afford the down payment without wiping out their savings. Maybe they take an expensive international trip they've been putting off. Maybe they upgrade their apartment because the financial anxiety that used to make the cheaper place feel necessary has finally eased. None of these things are wrong on their own, but if they pull your balance back below $80,000 or $70,000, you've just stepped back off the compound interest inflection point. You've traded the engine for the exhaust. The $100,000 milestone isn't a finish line, it's a launch pad. It is the point where the math starts doing a meaningful share of your financial heavy lifting. Every dollar you protect and keep invested at this level is worth dramatically more than a dollar you would protect at $20,000 because it has so much more time and principle behind it. The reward for hitting $100,000 isn't a vacation. The reward is watching your money grow at a rate that would have seemed impossible when you were staring at $4,000 in a savings account, wondering if any of this was actually worth it. Here's a contrast that might make this concrete in a way the numbers alone don't. Imagine two people who both experience a $5,000 emergency, maybe a medical bill, maybe a car repair, maybe a sudden job gap. Person A has $15,000 saved. They cover the expense, but they've just lost a third of their financial foundation. They're stressed. They feel like they've been knocked back. The emergency fund that took months to build has been significantly damaged, and the road back feels long. Person B has $100,000 saved. They cover the same $5,000 expense. Their portfolio barely registers the change. Their compound interest trajectory is essentially unaffected. Their stress response is completely different, not because they are a calmer person by nature, but because the math of their situation doesn't warrant the same level of alarm. Same emergency, completely different psychological and financial reality. The money doesn't just solve the problem, it changes the category the problem belongs to. And this is the thing that people who haven't experienced both sides of that equation sometimes struggle to believe. Financial security at this level isn't just about having more money, it's about being structurally insulated from the kind of cascading financial disasters that derail people's entire trajectories. When a $5,000 emergency forces someone with $15,000 in savings to pause their investing, skip retirement contributions for a few months, and rebuild their emergency fund, the actual cost of that emergency isn't $5,000. It's $5,000 plus the compound growth they missed during the rebuilding period, plus the psychological toll of feeling financially fragile again. That total cost is often 2 or 3 times the original expense. When the same emergency hits someone at $100,000, the true cost is just the $5,000. The rest of their financial life continues uninterrupted.
So what should you actually do when you hit this milestone? First, don't move the money. Seriously. Give yourself 30 days before making any significant financial decisions off the back of this achievement. The emotional high of hitting a major milestone is real, and it is not a good state to make large financial moves from. Second, review your asset allocation. At $100,000, you have enough invested that the difference between an appropriate allocation and a poor one is meaningful enough to warrant careful attention. If you've never looked seriously at how your money is distributed between stocks and bonds and cash, now is the time. Third, look at your fee structure. Are you in funds with expense ratios above 0.5%? At $100,000, those fees are costing you $500 or more per year. There are index funds that charge a fraction of that for the same market exposure. Fourth, increase your contribution if you possibly can. The compound interest engine you've built is at its most powerful when you're feeding it consistently. Even an additional $200 per month at this stage has an outsized impact because it's being multiplied by a much larger base. Look,
$100,000 in savings isn't going to let you retire tomorrow. It's not going to make your current financial challenges disappear. You're still going to have months where money is tight and decisions are hard. But it will change the rules of the game you're playing in a way that is genuinely difficult to explain to someone who hasn't experienced it. The math gets loud, the identity shifts, the fear changes direction, the opportunities expand. And perhaps most importantly, the version of you that had the discipline to build that foundation has already become someone fundamentally different from the person who is starting from zero. That identity doesn't go away when you check your balance. It compounds too. And if you're somewhere between $10,000 and $100,000 right now, staring at a number that feels both meaningful and frustratingly far from six figures, I want you to understand something. The gap between where you are and $100,000 is the hardest part. Not because it requires something extraordinary from you, but because you're doing all the right things before the math is big enough to reward you visibly. Keep going anyway. Your future self is not going to care that it took longer than you wanted. They're going to care that you didn't stop.